Greetings and salutations, our wonderful listeners. Welcome back to Life and Books and Everything after a summer hiatus. We are back. I don't know if I can say we're better than ever, but we are back, and I'm joined by Collin Hansen and Justin Taylor. And it's good to have the band back together as we are going to spend some time today just catching up a little bit on the summer. We'll talk about things we may have seen or listened to, maybe hit on a few current events, and of course, if we have time, we'll talk about some books. So glad that you're with us. Looking forward to this next season, which will stretch here at the end of the summer through the fall, Lord willing, until the end of the year. And it'll be the three of us, and sometimes it'll be one or two of us and interviewing others, but we're looking forward to at least the three of us getting to chat and maybe some people listening. We are sponsored again by Crossway, so grateful for their partnership and the many good books that they put out. And we want to mention one today, near and dear to our hearts, Rediscover Church. And it is co-authored by Collin and by Jonathan Lehman. Collin, tell us a little bit about this new Crossway book, which you have co-authored.
So this book has actually been in the works for a long time. Jonathan and I have been talking about a basic book that you could give to anybody in your church to be able to introduce them to what happens in the church and why it happens that way, God's vision for the church. But that vision was really renewed with what we saw last year with COVID-19. And of course, it's ongoing here. And so we've talked about this since our podcast began. I really haven't seen any situation like this in our churches. The division, the tension, the exhaustion that we feel over racial issues, political issues, COVID, now vaccines after masks, on and on and on and on and on. And this book, we're hoping, is going to be a way that church leaders can help unite their congregations around the gospel of Jesus Christ and God's vision for the church. And so we cover everything about outreach to membership to discipline to the ordinances to all that kind of stuff. And so we're excited about that. We think the timing is right. We also deal with things like virtual church and live streaming and things like that, but we're excited about that. But I think one of the coolest things is what Crossway has done to get behind this book, working along with TGC and with 9 Marks. And so between today, August 16 and August 30th, Crossway is going to be sending 20 copies to every church that requests one. There's a way to find that through Crossway's website, through TGC, through 9 Marks. And just free of charge. They will send you send in your information. They'll send you 20 free books, physical books. We're also translating the book right now into 20 different languages because this is a shared situation around the world. So yeah, it's been in the works quite a while, but it's really, really exciting right now. And so while supplies last, up to, it's pretty amazing to say, but Crossway's generosity means that up to 400,000 people will receive free copies of this book. It's pretty amazing. So thanks to Crossway, and excited to see what God might do with the book to help churches.
And Crossway really is generous, and there's lots of good people doing good things, but I'm always impressed by how Crossway really does want to think of ministry first and above all else. So thank you, and thank you for you and Jonathan working on that book. There's a lot of things we can talk about, and as we're recording this, and I imagine this is still going to be the case in the next day or two whenever this comes out, but Afghanistan is all in the news, and this is not a podcast where you tune in to hear us pretend to be experts in foreign policy, but such a tragedy unfolding in real time with the persecution already underway, it seems, and certainly threatened of Christians and churches, not to mention women and children and others who sided with the U.S. government over these years. We're not here to try to sort out foreign policy woes. But I just wonder at the outset, before we move on to other things, since this is front and center right now, if there are thoughts, lessons, or even just ways that you think we can be praying for the church in Afghanistan? Anything as we get started, Justin?
Yeah, we are called to pray for the persecuted church, to pray for our brothers and sisters in Christ. And of course, we're called not only to pray for fellow believers, but for the world, that everyone would be able to bow the knee and confess with their tongue that Jesus is Lord. So this is a great opportunity for us to pray, a great opportunity for us to love our neighbor, even our spiritual neighbor who is far from us. But what an unmitigated disaster. It seems like these days there's such difficulty finding any common ground politically on the spectrum. And this seems to be one of those rare events where no matter where you are on the political scale, you can agree that this is horrible. Whatever your views on interventionism and just war, etc., the way in which this came about and the way in which we carried out this policy is just producing large scale disaster and tragedy. So our hearts should go out. We really should lament and weep with those who weep. And it's a helpless feeling, of course, as just an ordinary citizen. It's not like you can cast some vote that will change things right now or do much of anything, but praying is something. And sometimes I find myself saying that sort of thing, like, I wish I could do more than pray. But prayer is something that we could do that other people can't do. They don't have the resources spiritually to appeal to the living God to act on their behalf. So let's pray. Let's keep our eyes open and keep our hearts tender towards what's going on there.
One of the things that it does throw into stark relief is how many blessings we have in this country, whatever faults and failures. And in the last few years, everyone from every angle has had plenty of things to be critical about in this country. And yet you see, now I know to be better than the Taliban is a pretty about as low a bar as you can have. And yet you see that civilization as we have come to know it in Western prosperous, basically free countries is not the norm throughout history. And it's easy to think that the civilizational default is human rights, fair elections, transfer of power, um, a criminal justice system which bends and has imperfections, but um, works most of the time, and rule of law and due process and religious toleration, all of these things that we can think, if we're ignorant of history, you know what, if you just sort of leave people that that's just what happens, and that's not what happens. And it's important for us to remember whenever we're criticizing the form of society or government we have now, which we're right to do, but we always have to ask the question, compared to what? Because if the comparison is perfection, utopia, heaven, well, if everyone were angels, well, we can look forward to that as Christians in heaven, but that's not the alternative. What is the alternative compared to what? And certainly things can be there's a big sliding scale between Western democracies, constitutional republics, and the Taliban. And yet, hopefully, maybe it will help all of us to one, appreciate many of the blessings that we have and have had for many, many years. And Lord willing, are extended to more people now in this country. And those freedoms will be protected. And it also shows us sometimes how our, there's that joke throwaway line, first world problems. I've people have said it to me. I've said it to my kids as they're complaining about their shoes wearing out after 3 months or something, and they need new shoes. First world problems. But it really is the case that sometimes, and I guess Ross Douthat might call this a culture of decadence, but the sort of things that we get animated about, the sort of things that we think are life altering, absolutely soul crushing, and then you see the Taliban, you realize just how horrendous and egregious and sinful and as many bad words as you can pile up, humans can be. And it gives us pause not to exaggerate our own suffering, our own offendedness, and also hopefully leads us to give thanks for the many things that we do have, even as we pray, most importantly, as Justin has called us to so rightly. Any other thoughts, Colin, as we get started?
Yeah, a lot of times my instincts are to think about the political ramifications of something. I wonder, what does this mean for elections? I wonder, what was the Trump administration thinking when they negotiated? I mean, that's where my mind goes, but this is a different reaction for me this time, and I'm not sure why. I just noticed my attitude about things really changes as I get older. And one of these areas is and it may change by the time this podcast comes out, but I just wonder, where is our president? I want to hear from the commander in chief. This is not a political thing. I want to know what's happening. I want to
Right.
know that somebody is. I want to know that the soldiers that we've deployed there are not going to be surrounded and cut off. I mean, there's a lot of questions there. So for me, I'm not, my instincts in this case, even though I wonder about those things, it's not primarily about what does this mean for Republicans or Democrats or Trump or Biden or midterm elections or re-elections, or what are the Republicans who are going to challenge Biden? What are they saying? And so I just wonder, as an American, I'm I'm worried. I'm not worried for my personal safety. That's a luxury that you just talked about there, Kevin. I'm not worried for my personal safety, but this is disturbing. And I'm just worried for those people. I watched Ken Burns' Vietnam documentary, and I was born, we were all born after Vietnam, and so just watching the way everything played out with the end and the fall of Saigon and everything, and I guess it just confuses me for people like President Biden who lived through that. I want to know what's going through his head as he sees this and what his plan is. So I hope that comes across the right way, but I just it's concerning. I wonder, where is the president?
Yeah. So please, I'm sure more information will be out, and by the time this is out there, but Justin's absolutely right that praying can feel like a throwaway, but it's absolutely not. And God hears those prayers, and we are commanded to pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters, and just sharing the bonds of humanity. Of course, we pray and don't want anyone to be tortured and the sort of absolutely horrendous terrorist activity going on. So we pray for that. I want to back up, and there's no great transition from that, but this is the first time that we've been doing a podcast for several months, and we've had the summer, and won't get the blow by blow, but we all like sports, and that's some of our listeners, and so you can be patient if it's not your thing. But I know we were texting last week with the Field of Dreams game. So there was the movie back in '89, and it's a movie about fatherhood as much as about baseball, but it is sort of a strange movie, but it's a tearjerker, and it's become sort of etched in the American pantheon of movies, I guess. And so many years in the making, they had this game right next to the set where they filmed this in Dyersville, Iowa. First Major League Baseball game, Yankees and White Sox. I'm a lifelong White Sox fan, born on the south side of Chicago. Great outcome for the White Sox. Now they went on to lose 2 or 3 of the Yankees, but we don't care about that. They blew the lead, came back, Tim Anderson. Great script. The ambiance was, I mean, I am not a crier, so I didn't literally cry. Wasn't like when, I wept tears over Miley Cyrus's career direction. No, I didn't actually, but I was watching it, and for a Dutchman, I was getting the feelings. I was getting moved, and it was overwrought, but it worked. And the music and the Kevin Costner stare, and I felt like, and I tweeted this, uh, I felt like maybe there was just a little glimmer, a glimpse of some piece of Americana that we could celebrate. There was nostalgia, but it was also looking to the future. You had teams that are filled with white and black, and lots of Hispanics and Dominicans, and you have a great ending to it. And it felt like something that everyone was excited about urban meets rural, and a simple fun, and let alone that Iowans were there. So I loved it, and it was nice to see something that seemed like just grown men playing baseball. And that's sort of the spirit of the movie. They really seemed to think this was really cool. And to hear Joe Buck say, and another one into the corn. I mean, it was a great tagline to see them. And did you hear that they had to go in after they'd had a storm and they put metal rods in the corn out there so it would look proper? I mean, well done, MLB, and well done, Iowa. Justin, I can't believe you fled your own state to Chicago when this was happening.
Yeah, I've never been to the Field of Dreams, and I don't really like baseball, so I'm a great one to comment on this. I actually got a text, I think, from Kevin saying, like, how can you be out of town? Because I went to Chicago during that and didn't know that it was coming. But yeah, Dyersville is about 4 hours exactly east of here on Highway 20. And so I could drive by it at some point and get all the nostalgia and cry like a Dutchman upon the view of corn. It would be beautiful to behold.
You're really killing the vibe here, Justin.
Yeah,
I think
you
Kevin
are.
should
You're,
have.
you're what's wrong with America. Didn't you
think-
listen to James Earl Jones? Baseball.
I do. I mean, one of my thoughts was it would be great to age as well as Kevin Costner has. That would be kind of on the
We
bucket
all
list.
do wish we were movie stars and had
Yeah,
those
that's
looks
true.
and those resources.
Even he had the Untuck T-shirt. I don't know if it was an official Untuck It. They can be a sponsor, but it just looked good, and I just think, yeah, our Midwestern flair would not carry as well, I'm afraid. Did you enjoy the spectacle?
Well, I mean, I think I love our listeners, love hearing from you guys. You guys all know that we're Midwestern guys, and it does have a special resonance. I mean, I played baseball surrounded by cornfields growing up. I played baseball. I played football with corn stalks flying in our faces and things like that. So there's going to be a special resonance there, and especially also, I mean, I was 8 years old when Field of Dreams came out, and I rewatched it recently. I don't think I was even thinking about this, but that movie hits you completely differently as a dad.
Yeah, it does.
Completely differently as a dad, especially when your kids are playing baseball and thinking that way. And yeah, so I was really impressed with what they did. The moment of them walking out of the corn,
Oh, really well done.
that was pretty darn cool. And I'm like you, Kevin, in that I thought of it as kind of a template for some things that can work if we're trying to figure out a way to move forward in unity, because no one wants to go back to that time of the early 20th century for a variety of reasons. We want things the way they are in terms of the people who get to play. I was just at the Negro Leagues Museum in Kansas City this last weekend, and how exciting to see Aaron Judge and Tim Anderson be heroes in that game. So nobody wants to go back to that part. And yet there is something that we can recover from the past that is unifying and is beneficial. And part of that's the continuity of the game of baseball and the inclusiveness of baseball now, especially as it spread and the way it comes in and it spread to a place like Japan, of all places. And I think that's something that's worth celebrating and building on. And I'm just at a stage of life when I see something like that, and I put the Olympics in the same category. When I see something like that, I want to celebrate it. I want to appreciate it for what it is. I want to just enjoy the game. And I don't want to try to pick it to death, which, by the way, is a good way to watch the movie Field of Dreams. Do not think about it too much.
No.
Do not try to be logical about it. And that's just kind of similar here. I want to appreciate it for what it is, and I want to start dreaming about, wow, what if they came to America's oldest ballpark, Rickwood Field in Birmingham? What if they did a game there? That'd be great. Anyway, so that's what I was thinking, Kevin.
Yeah, I think there is the if there's any way in which we have some semblance of unity as a country and healing, to use that term, it seems to me it has to be in not trying to move back to the past, but not telling people you have to eradicate the past
Or
and
hate the
shame on you
past.
for hating it. And so
Yeah.
I showed you an article that somebody had written that was more largely negative about the event, and his whole argument was we're celebrating an event that celebrates a movie, that celebrates a baseball player who comes from a time in Major League history when African Americans weren't even allowed to be in the same integrated league. Well, that is true factually, and we can lament that. And yet, that seems a profound mistake to me, and no way to move forward to essentially say, a movie, because it has Shoeless Joe Jackson as a central theme, and it comes from an era um, where America was racist and segregation, and baseball was not integrated. Therefore, anything from that gone. Shame on you. I mean, the logical implication of that is untenable, unworkable, not just rationally, but just from the human spirit. You can't just say that part of history, you can't have it. You can't like anything from it. You can't celebrate anything from it. We have to be able to say what is good but still imperfect. And but we're not saying let's get in the time machine and go live there and everything was great if we could just be back with Charles Comiskey, who seemed to be a horrendous person as he was the owner for the White Sox. So I enjoyed it, especially as a Sox fan and the home run. But you mentioned the Olympics. Justin, Collin, I watched tons of Olympics. It's one time say I'm not going to feel bad. I'm going to turn the TV on, let my kids stay up. We're going to try to watch as much as we can. What were some of the high points for the Olympics for you guys? Justin, did you watch it? Did you know it was happening? I don't know. Were you paying attention? Did you see that?
I knew it was happening, but I'm like a terrible co-host today for these topics because I hardly watch.
I thought you liked sports. You're just on like Huskers
He's just-
24/7.
He's been it's just Huskers and Justin Fields. Those are the only things that Justin Taylor cares about.
So you didn't watch the Olympics. You didn't pay attention to anything.
I hardly watch, and it was interesting to see somebody speculate on Twitter why the ratings were so terrible for it. Is it because of cord cutting with people not having cable anymore? Is it because of the time differences? Is it because of knowing in advance if you wanted to know who was going to win or lose? Was it some of the
no fans
protest elements? Yeah, no fans to it. I mean, just changes the dynamics. I know you really enjoyed it, but it just kind of felt like work to be able to go and find it, watch it, invest in it. So I didn't watch very much at all. To Kevin's chagrin.
Shame on you. All right.
You missed
from the Russian Olympic Committee to Collin.
That 400-meter final. I mean, how
The
amazing.
hurdles.
Yeah,
Both
the
of
hurdles.
them.
Thank you.
Men
yes.
and women.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. I mean, I'm not going to pretend I'm not like Kevin and his kids. I mean, who actually know running, do this and are good at it competitively, read the magazines, all that sort of stuff. I'm just your show up and whoa, there's a guy from Norway who's really good.
Oh yeah, he's been good. Yeah, Karsten Warholm.
Okay, well that's fascinating, but also but gosh, but wait a minute. So he breaks the world record, but so does the American
Ryan Benjamin. Yeah,
exactly, which is absolutely amazing. And I think I don't know if it's because of COVID-19. Again, I don't know if it was because I have kids, but I have a greater appreciation for sports, which seems kind of crazy that I would people who know me, including you guys, would know that I love sports already. But I really cherished being able to see all of the human stories, the competitiveness, drawing the best out of people, rising to the occasion, improving themselves, pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But also, I felt like there was generally a lot of camaraderie among the athletes, even within rivalry, including with Warholm. There still seemed to be. I mean, you could tell there was clear rivalry, but at the same time, there seemed to be respect, and there was pushing, and so I mean, typical for where we are as a country right now. Everything was obsessed with Simone Biles and a few.
Right.
I mean, nothing wrong with Simone Biles being obsessed with her. She's great, but just the her decision. I think it should have been an opportunity for us to just talk about how we shouldn't take these things for granted, how fragile it is mentally and physically. And again, this is something probably because I get older now. I'm struck not only by the people who succeed, but now and by the underdog stories, but now I'm struck by the people who fail and the
Mm-hmm.
parents who are there and all they've invested and the devastation, especially with the Olympics every 4 or this case 5
Yeah,
years.
sometimes a false start or
Oh,
a
exactly.
slip or a drop, and you've been
The
working your whole life.
agony, the
Yeah.
agony of defeat seems to stand out for me than it used to. And I'm not so much judgmental, including in Simone Biles' case. I'm just more sympathetic of like, wow, you work so hard every day. So much has been invested into this for this one moment. And then it doesn't happen. It helps you appreciate greatness because you're able to see how fragile it can be, even with the greatest of all time, as Simone Biles.
Yeah. Yeah, when I we won't talk about the day that Kevin DeYoung tried to break the internet on accident, but I was on vacation and the timing was bad. I didn't know all that was going to happen on the same day. But when I tweeted then a couple weeks later, and I just trying to make light of it and said, "Did I miss anything on the internet?" And I did see that somebody wrote or tweeted at me and said, "Well, basically, half of the country is really mad at Simone Biles right now, and the other half is really mad at you." So that was, and they're different. They didn't overlap. Who was mad at Simone? Yeah. So Justin, once you figured out the schedule, if you would have looked up the track and field schedule, you could have got the exact start time for every event, Justin. And you realize that the timing was actually pretty good because the evening events in Tokyo aired live here, Central Time, from about 6 in the morning till 8:30, and then the morning finals aired about 8 to 10:30 in the evening. And so we were able to watch it. Swimming and track are the ones that we watched almost every second that we could.
What was your highlight? What was your favorite part?
So because yes, we are a bit of a track and field. We know, I'm not person, but we know all the names. We follow. We're gonna watch the Diamond League. I'm sure there's a whole track season out there, folks. The Diamond League, uh, or it's the Prefontaine Classic out in Oregon this Saturday. You can see Sha'Carri Richardson's going to race the 100 against the three Jamaicans who won. Lots of good people still race. So we follow this stuff, and there's certain of the American Olympians that we've really come to like. So I think Mo is amazing, 19-year-old
Wow.
Southern Sudan family immigrated, but she's lived almost or maybe her whole life in New Jersey. She is amazing. Yeah, the 400 hurdles on the women's side, Sydney McLaughlin, who acquits herself very well and seems to be giving a wonderful, credible profession of faith and glory to God in the midst of this. And Dalilah Muhammad is really professional about it. So I loved watching the two of them as they go back and forth and break world records, almost anything. And some of on the swimming side, Caleb Dressel is the you know, on the male side, the American who wins almost everything that he's in, but he hadn't won an individual gold. And when he did his first, here's this big, huge, hulking sort of guy, and he's just a flutter of tears but of joy. So that was even moving to me to see the genuine expressions of joy. And as cheesy as it seemed at first, they would set up a little screen and you would see your family back home watching you. And to see on the Olympians immediately when they saw their family or heard their family or their hometown cheering for them, th- just tears and joy and how much it meant to have other people and their family who couldn't be there in person. Those were touching moments. So I enjoyed watching it, and I would have to imagine the ratings are down for all those reasons, Justin. People just it's not like even 20 years ago, okay, everyone click on NBC and let's watch this. It's diffused across several NBC platforms. It is, unless you go looking, it's sort of hard to tell where can I find what's happening live, what's going on. And people just it does take something away of the energy of you're all cheering. I mean, you could still hear, a handful of people in the crowd. So I'm always sad when the Olympics go. The Winter Olympics just, I mean, that's something, but a lot of people just flying down hills of ice and let's shoot things and ski around. But it was great. I enjoyed it. Okay,
we
go
should
ahead,
mention
Justin.
though that I saw on Twitter that they're talking about making cornhole into an Olympic
It's
sport.
true.
Which for Midwestern middle-aged guys, there's a wave of hope sweeping across the heartland right now.
Well, I told you that one of my sons, how old is he? 12, said, "Dad, I think they should make spike ball an Olympic sport, and I don't think we need horse trotting."
Hey, dressage, that was pretty cool. That was one of the highlights. That was one of the highlight clips in there. I will say, anybody who doesn't think cornhole is an Olympic sport, which, okay, watch curling. Tell me how
People
curling
really get into curling.
Is all that different from cornhole, and with the same demographic of people who seem to succeed in it.
Yes.
What is Jim Gaffigan's line about bowling? If you can smoke while you're doing it, it's not really a legitimate sport. Cornhole, probably.
Well, it was it Boris Johnson's line a few Olympics ago that when the UK was winning, he said, "We really excel at sports where you're sitting down," because they looked and they were good at rowing and cycling and anything that involved you can remain seated. The UK, the Brits were really good at it. I wonder, just this could be a whole podcast unto itself, but in Collin, you've already weighed in publicly, at least on one of the episodes. But I know, like many people, we've all been listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast that Mike Cosper is doing, and doing very excellently. What are your quick takeaways? What do you like about it? Things you disagree about it? Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, like many listeners, I'm riveted to it and can't wait till the next one comes out. And I hope that's
kind of like Life and Books and Everything, I imagine. If we're an hour late, people are just all over us online.
By the way, I've had two female friends say to me independently, "Oh, I love your podcast. I fast forward all of the sports parts, but so welcome back to the listeners."
They're gonna love this.
They're gonna love.
It's
Hey, well, they
over.
didn't get my soliloquy to Corn about how many wonderful things we owe in life to Corn. Okay, we'll do that another time.
Bonus episode.
Yeah, we should do this live from the Corn Palace in Mitchell someday. But
the Enchanted Doll Museum nearby.
Blizzards at the DQ across the street.
Oh,
yeah, that's right.
Now you're talking. Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's I think for the three of us, it's not an academic, abstract, arm's length thing to listen to, because all of us knew Mark at some level and had some involvement in the movement that he was a part of. So it's interesting to listen to something that it's not ancient history to us, or listening to a podcast on the Jesus people where we didn't have any intersection with any of the players. So it's sad, and it's as you said, Kevin, Mike does a really good job. Just apart from content, the narrative flow of it, the fact that you can actually listen to people. This could have been a serialized set of articles, or it could have been a book. But to actually hear Mark's voice and to hear other people talking about their experiences, it's very, very interesting, and it's very sad. I think especially when you put together things that have happened over a couple decades and compress them together to hear some of the outlandish and abusive things that he said, kind of play those back to back. I think in terms of judging how the whole podcast holds together, kind of want to reserve judgment until Mike's able to complete the whole thing, because he's going somewhere and he has more episodes planned. So people are dissecting it on Twitter. Why isn't he talking about this? Why hasn't he interviewed this person? And so we'll want to wait to see kind of where he's going here and what sort of angles he's going to cover in the future. But yeah, as you said, Kevin, we could devote an entire episode just to talking about this podcast.
Collin, your quick thoughts?
Yeah, quick thoughts. So a couple different things. One of them is that if you're looking at this from a Christian media perspective, which we're all in different ways, but I think we're going to see a before and after this podcast. This will be revolutionary in terms of Christian media. When you're one of the top 4 podcasts in the entire world, which this is, that's quite a statement. And so I would say this is probably the biggest phenomenon I've seen in Christian media in the last 11 years. So
since Veggie Tales.
Yeah, since Veggie Tales, exactly. So this is a big deal to be able to show people within a Christian space the power of narrative podcasts. So we're going to see a lot of imitations of it that are not going to be nearly as good. I do think that this is a perfect storm. It's a perfect storm of Mike's abilities with Christianity Today's investment in it, with that particular story, which Mike knows really well personally, which it gives him a lot of ability there. The timing that it took to be able to do this, and also the broad appeal to people outside the church of all different kinds of traditions, to former angry, grew up evangelicals, disenchanted, to reformed guys like us who want to know how it plays out, who lived with it. So it's really just quite a phenomenon. Second, I will say in the church, in some ways, it's going to be before and after this podcast, because just a wide scale, we're talking 600,000 plus listeners on this thing. The wide scale listening of it at congregational levels, elders, pastors, means that this is going to be in the ether as people think about leadership in the church. And so I don't know quite exactly what all the implications are going to be, but it's certainly going to contribute to probably a very healthy skepticism towards certain types of leadership that we've all seen tolerated too much. But it's going to have some bad effects as well in terms of bringing heightened skepticism toward proper uses of biblical authority. That's one thing. So it's that kind of a big deal. But one last thing just to say is, so many people, I see them really wrestling with these things for the first time because they just didn't know this stuff. Of course, we've known a lot of this for a long time. And so you'll see a lot of people, and we've seen a lot of people talk about the need for a reckoning in the church. I would actually say that it's not like this podcast is introducing these concepts or forcing this. That reckoning actually started, as far as I can tell, in 2010. So this reckoning's been going on for 11 years. In terms of people like us talking with, debating, praying about, arguing over the implications of all of this stuff happening, and the other situations that that could be the fodder for future podcasts. So I hope that actually comes as an encouragement to people, but this is not like, oh yeah, and then for a decade or something like that, it just sat dormant. No, actually had a lot of people spending a lot of time trying to think about the implications of this. I don't know what you guys think about that, but that's one thing I hope people know.
Yeah. I'll just give a few quick thoughts. Number one, as you already said, the production value is high. Everyone recognizes that. The way it's Malcolm Gladwell-esque, that's very high praise in weaving together original archival footage and interviews. And Mike is a good narrator in between. So it deserves high praise for that. It's very well done. It's riveting. I know when I get relatives and grandparents and people who are asking when's the next one coming out, it's hit an audience that wouldn't normally just listen to a podcast like this. Number two, you talked about stories. I think you're right, Colin. I think we will see many other stories like this. I mean, there'll somebody's somebody working on the Crystal Cathedral and Robert Schuller, is someone working on Bill Hybels in Willow Creek. There's all sorts of someone just going to do something like this more broadly on Reform Resurgence, Young Restless Reform. Your book, well, on my book, Colin, but I'll give you credit for it.
Of course, it was James McDonald.
Yes,
James
yes.
McDonald,
I know
who
that
wrongly
story.
attributed.
So I think there will be many others, and some of those stories will be worth telling, and some will be told well, and then some won't. And then third category here, yes, there's a lot of lessons, and maybe when it's wrapped up, you're right, Justin. Maybe we see the total picture. It's worth revisiting on this podcast some of the lessons from it. Certainly, we see many of the elements of Mars Hill as a cautionary tale. Though I think for the most part, I would, Mike better than I do. I don't know if I've met him before, Justin, but for the most part, I think Mike has been trying to be fair with, hey, a lot of good things happened. And Mark said some of the earlier episodes, there was a few of them. I had to remind myself, oh yeah, the story ends badly because, wow, that was courageous. I'm glad he brought that up. I'm glad he said that. I'm glad he was willing there. And when you were in that moment, especially if you didn't have a front row seat, you had a bleacher seat. You really saw, wow, this yeah, there's some bombast and there's some, I wouldn't say things quite the same way, and there's an edginess, but wow, Mark is saying things that need to be said, and he's saying the right things, and he's coming down on the right side of inerrancy and uh, propitiation and all sorts of and reform theology. And so it's easy now to want to say who knew what when and how could people let this happen. Oh, and at times, he seems really humble to learn and to be a part of other people's lives, and you don't know everything that's maybe happening or when there was a change. So I think Mike's done a nice job of trying to present the genuine positives, along with many cautionary tales of, of, of poor leadership. And I mean the episode that is the hardest to listen to and probably raises the most questions, and maybe one that I would at least disagree with some of the framing, is episode 5, talking about men's and women's. At times it seems like the only criticisms were coming from the left, and that, hey, is complementarianism really the problem here, when there were many critics, especially when the marriage book came out, and those talks started coming out, criticisms from the right. But I hear what you're saying, Justin, to let Mike finish what he wants to do and who he wants to talk to. And sometimes it's a product of who's willing to talk to him on the record and record with things. So that's the other thing, is I sometimes the framing of the issues I would put a different way, but it is a riveting story. There are many cautionary tales in there. There are also genuine works. I mean, I have a friend who was there for part of it, and he has a hard time listening to it because his experience was mainly good and what he learned about Jesus and things that were helpful in that context. And then the last thing I say, and this isn't maybe so much a criticism of the podcast as it is just a caution for each of us in our human hearts. I know I can feel at times, I think there's a place to tell the story. I think there's a place to tell people's private interactions, but it does feel it's right on the knife's edge for me. Mark Driscoll is still a living human being. He's still doing ministry. I don't know what it's like. I hear things that don't sound good, but he's there, and he's a real person and not just a historical artifact. And so it seems one thing to publicly critique public statements in sermons and books and other things, and not that it's out of place to hear people's private stories and telling what happened. But I just have more of a caution, because I know that, hey, I have stories I could share, and you know what? There's people who could share stories about me that look good and don't look as good. Hopefully, would not look as bad as some of these stories look. But I just want us to be careful in our Christian hearts that there could be a way that we're drawn to the story as one is drawn in a worldly sense to any kind of soap opera, to any sort of juicy tidbits about someone's life and about the things that happen. And that's not necessarily wrong. We gravitate towards stories and we learn from those stories, but it's just a caution that we don't end up we don't want to foster a sense of gossip or everybody who's got a private story to tell, let's hear it. Am I being overly sensitive to that caution?
Well, I mean, I think it's another topic that we could do a whole episode on, and I wonder if that distinction that you make between a living person and subject and a dead person actually is a legitimate distinction. In other words, why is it okay? I've read some stuff about Abraham Lincoln that Abraham Lincoln would be mortified that anybody passed along, and I don't know if it's 100% true, but somebody said it back in the 1820s or whatever. Why is that okay, but it's not okay to say private stuff now? Or should we use more discretion even in our historical work? I think it's a really tricky subject to think through.
To clarify,
Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, I wasn't, that's a good point. And I wasn't saying that if someone dies, then you can say private thing. My point in mentioning that Mark is still a living person was just to give us, some heart level pause that we are talking about a real human being who professes faith in Christ for whatever massive flaws that we can point out. And it's easy to think that's not a real person. So that's all I was saying about that Mark Driscoll is not just the fulfillment of all that went wrong for a period of time in evangelicalism, but is a real person with a wife and kids and a human being. So that's one issue. And then, the secondary issue is, when do we do the public in private? So go ahead, Justin.
No, it's an important reminder, and how to think through all of that, I think, is just complicated, because I think I can imagine people listening to this and thinking, well, that's precisely the way in which abuse thrives, is because people don't talk about what they experience in private. So I think there's a legitimate point there, and we do need to think through. I'll just say from my own heart, I have to thank God for people who are exposing abuse. It has kind of lurked beneath the surfaces and been covered up in the past, and there are people who are working diligently to bring the evil to light of day. And yet, I can find my own heart drawn towards things that obviously seem like gossip, and that my heart is more inclined to read about what some pastor did terribly than what some pastor did well. And so that's, for me, it's a heart issue, and probably all of us need to think through, what are we inclined towards? What are we, what gets our juices flowing to some degree? I don't have it solved.
Well, that's what I was going to say, Justin, was I don't know about the living or dead distinction, but I would we know that this is getting a lot of attention because it's like a car crash. It's so mangled and horrific. You can't turn away. And so if we want to say this podcast is good and necessary because it's going to help root out abuse in the church, well, I can certainly see God using it to do that, and I'll give thanks for that. We've been in a situation where so many of us, I can see myself in this at least, have tolerated Christian leaders who don't show basic qualifications for leadership that God lays out in Scripture. So if it has that effect, then I'm grateful. I could also say that if what we need is a podcast to be able to help us to root out abuse or to show how to avoid that, I could also say I could introduce people to we all could, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of pastors who would be positive examples of how to not do this. But see, of course, that would never get any attention. So you really can't separate the car crash element of this from the lesson from it. And that's just, I don't know if that's our human hearts, our media ecosystem. I'm not really sure, but that's what it is right now.
I don't think we're disagreeing, Justin. I just want to clarify again, lest somebody hear me saying, uh, yeah, abuse victims shouldn't speak out. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm not saying that in life, nor am I saying that in this podcast. And just like a good journalist would spend months or years in uncovering a story and talk to victims and get their story and things that it's not that private things are off limits for public knowledge. Um, what I want to say is, I guess I put it like this. I think I'll put it very personally, practically. I've thought, well, no one reached out to me. I mean, I was in for some of this, but I don't need to. I'm not a necessary voice in this podcast. But I think, what if someone said, would you want to come on and do you have any Mark Driscoll stories? I think Mike's doing it better than that, I'm sure. But if that was it, I would think, well, yeah, I could share a couple stories, and I could give you my 3 or 4 anecdotes. And um, I don't know that that would be appropriate or would be helpful or would be the best way. Just anybody got a story about hanging out with Mark Driscoll and something he said in particular, something that was bad, or that's what I'm saying is, I think, a danger lurking in the human heart when you do something that is focused and could become just an opportunity for. So most of the podcast isn't like that, but there have been a time or two where there's a long story about, it's like, well, yeah, I that seems pretty bad and puts him in a bad light, and I just find myself, hey, give me more of those stories, and there's something in my heart that I want to be cautious about when I start getting that feeling.
Yeah, well said.
Last word on that?
No, I'll let you have the last word. Good word.
All right, as we wrap up life and books and everything, we haven't talked about books. So were you guys able to read some books over the summer? I know you're both working, well, all of us were working on some different writing projects, and that maybe took up a lot of their time. But Collin, give us a few books from this summer.
So I know we've talked about this before, but I want to encourage people again that audiobooks are a major secret that can help you with your reading. I know some people don't think of it that way, and I do a lot of reading that's not audiobooks, but I have been in a season of the most intense writing of my life, and it's been something. And so audiobooks have been a real blessing during that time. And so one audiobook that I appreciated was Andrew Roberts' Churchill, Walking with Destiny, which we've talked about on this podcast before. So spent this summer, that's an 1,100-page book. It's a 30 plus, no, maybe 50 hour. Maybe, I think it's a 50-hour audiobook.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was great. It's, everybody says it's great. It is great. Second, 2 books that I did read and that hopefully I'll be able to talk about on my Gospel Bound podcast. But one of them is Jeffrey Bilbrow's Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news. If listeners out there have appreciated some of the comments that, when we often discuss media and our interaction with media, including podcasts here, Bilbrow is doing that really well from that perspective. One of the best books I've read in a long time that directly relates to my vocation and all of our consumption and use of media in this time. So that was great. And then next month I'll be interviewing former Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam about his book Faithful Presence: The Promise and the Peril of Faith in the Public Square. Really appreciated him when he was in office. And was very popular and successful in office. And as far as I know, is a member of a PCA congregation, if I remember correctly, Kevin. But you'll recognize Faithful Presence from James Davison Hunter's work to Change the World from 2010. But this book it's coming full circle to what we talked about of discouragement, confusion in politics, it's helpful to see a devout Christian reflect in very thoughtful ways about how to lead through elected office. So three books I really enjoyed reading, and then one I listened to over the summer.
It's good. Justin, what have you been reading?
Yeah, I haven't read this summer, so just kidding.
He didn't watch the
Olympics?
Olympics. He hates baseball. He didn't read. I don't know how we're friends.
But it's all Huskers all the time. I was able to get into a few books. I'm reading multiple books at once, dipping here and there. At a spiritual level, Brian Chappell's book, The Gospel According to Daniel, A Christ-Centered Approach. I was kind of surprised when I picked it up and realized I had a blurb on the back of it, but it's time to reread the whole thing. Paul House has a Tyndale commentary on the Old Testament, on the book of Daniel, replacing Joyce Baldwin's, and Christopher Wright has a commentary. Christopher Wright is a really good writer. I don't follow all of his stuff on Mission, but his books on the Old Testament, if you ever pick them up, are really good. And they started as sermons. He's a bona fide Old Testament scholar, but has a sermonic touch as well. So Daniel's one of those books I get the big picture of what's going on as it gets into later chapters and gets more eschatological in terms of prophecies. I couldn't defend the amillennial view, which I hold. So just want to, in terms of spiritual work through Daniel. Crossway has just republished, you guys have probably noticed this, several books by J.I. Packer, also by Francis Schaeffer. And what we've been doing there is taking books that are published by other publishers that are in paperback and licensing hardcover editions to them, doing it in the Crossway typesetting with Crossway hardcovers with jackets. So on vacation, I brought Keep in Step with the Spirit by Packer, which really like Mark Jones' description on the back where he calls it polemically ironic. He says, seeking to promote peace in the church, Packer also desired purity. In this book, he offers an argument against certain opinions of the Spirit with a greater goal in mind, the peace of God's people as they share a unified understanding of the Holy Spirit's work. If his ironicism is the end, his polemics are the means. Mark Dever blurbed the book too, but it's fascinating to go through and watch how Packer argues, enumerating the things that the charismatics get right, that they do better than the Reformed, more traditionalist, and then showing what's deficient, and then kind of proposing, we could call it a third way to move forward. It also strikes me, reading Packer, all of the comments about evangelicalism and how partisan it is, and the closing of the evangelical mind, and how deficient it is. I mean, if anyone else follows the same sort of Twitter accounts that we do, it's a constant theme. But then I read Packer and think, this is evangelicalism. This is evangelicalism kind of at its best. And Packer just doesn't fit any of those caricatures. So it's good to work through some of the charismatic issues with Packer as a guide. Another book I bought on vacation, an author that I enjoy reading, Hampton Sides, In the Kingdom of Ice, The Grand and Terrible Polar Voyage of the USS Jeanette.
Read that one, I think, earlier this year.
Hampton Sides wrote one of my favorite books on the assassination of Martin Luther King. And he's just a master of the narrative nonfiction form. And Candace Millard, who also is a good author of that, in her blurb, she says, as soon as I finished the book, I flipped to the first page and began reading again. So that kind of book, which is high praise, obviously. And the last book that I've started to dip into is by Michael Ward, who, of course, did the groundbreaking work on C.S. Lewis and Narnia books and the planets and the deeper meaning there. Has published After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And I've long concurred with the belief that The Abolition of Man is a classic of 20th century natural law, concisely done, a profound work, and the sort of work that it's really helpful to have a guide to help you see the philosophical underpinnings and the sort of things that Lewis assumed. So I'm eager to get into Michael Ward's book. And the publisher published a little version of Abolition of Man to go along with it, so you can read the original classic and read Ward's guide to it as well.
For the first time this year, I guess a hat tip to, doesn't Andrew Wilson do this, but I'm keeping a list of all the books that I'm reading this year. I don't know if I'll publish it at the end of the year or not, if that serves people or not. Of course, I read books in different ways. We've talked about that before, some very carefully, some quickly to get the gist of it. Sometimes they'll say, here's a big book, I'm going to give it 2 hours, I'm going to get as much as I can. And then other times it's your companion for many months, as I was reading through the 2 volumes on Princeton Seminary from David Calhoun. But I finished a number of books. I started some others, but I'll limit myself to just 3 from this summer. One, this is a book I had read years ago. It's a little book. I picked it up again. Stephen Osmond, who is a very well-respected historian from Harvard. He has a little book, Ancestors, The Loving Family of Old Europe, which was in some ways, it was a new work, but it was in some ways a distillation of a work he had published in the 80s with the auspicious title When Fathers Ruled. And it was basically about life and marriage and family life in pre-Reformation and Reformation Europe. Well, this is a shorter version, Ancestors, The Loving Family in Old Europe. It's just fascinating because here's a top-notch historian looking at primary sources, and he has woodcuts, he has some old illustrations. It's really fascinating to see, here's an illustration from Germany in the 16th century of a pregnant woman, and they label all the things that happens to a pregnant woman. Or here's a manual of childbearing. And you see things that are very much the same, then you see things that look really different. But one of the themes in Osmond's work on family and marriage in 15th, 16th century Europe was to push against some of the scholarship that basically said it was just unremitting horrors and stark authoritarianism, and he's trying to say they were more like us in some ways and unlike us in other ways. So really fascinating, and maybe we'll bring that in a topic. I've been reading just as maybe a future thoughts percolating on book ideas years down the line. I've just been reading a lot about family life, about marriage, about both current and historical. So that was an interesting book. Another history book, Gary Stewart. You know Gary, right, Justin? From your time at Bethlehem?
Yep. We were classmates together at Bethlehem in 1998.
So this is his published dissertation. I think I had read the dissertation or looked through it briefly when I was working on my PhD, but now it's published. I don't have it right in front of me if it's Oxford or Cambridge, but congratulations, Gary. It's called Justifying Revolution, American Clergy's Argument for Public Resistance. So it's basically what was the Christian argument for revolution in the colonies. And so it's a published dissertation, so it's thick and it's footnote, but it's not that long, and it's really helpful to think about it. And I guess I'm partial to it because maybe I'm a small part of this project, along with Paul Helseth and a number of other people who are trying to push back against what some of the older historiography said, namely that the Christian support for America and for the new republic and for revolution was a capitulation to Enlightenment ideas, or was really selling out their reformed birthright for republicanism. And Stewart's book does a good job saying, well, whether you agree with him or not, there were careful Christian theological arguments to justify the colonists' revolution. And so he has 5 or 6 different chapters looking at different people. And so I found that very interesting. And then a book I blogged about earlier in the summer, Heralds of God by James S. Stewart. So he's a Church of Scotland minister. He wrote this book, I think, in the 40s. And the discerning reader will wonder, I wonder where he was theologically on a few things. But put that aside. It's as a preacher, I try to read each summer a book on preaching. Sometimes I'll go back to Lloyd Jones' Preaching and Preachers, but this is one I hadn't read before. I had heard Alistair Begg recommend it, and I found it very invigorating for the pastoral preaching task. And that's one of my goals with whatever writing I have each summer, is to come back and feel re-energized and reinvigorated for preaching. And so I blogged about that earlier in the summer, because I think one of the great struggles we face as pastors is it can feel like intellectually we know preaching matters, and yet it feels like, well, blogging matters, podcasts matter, Twitter matters, books matter, conferences matter, hot takes matter. Who's shaping people? Who are our people talking about during the week? They're talking about an article that they read from this place or that, or they're talking about and hopefully we're not part of the problem. So all of those things can be good, but it can feel like, as a pastor, is the task of preaching, does that really, I know the answer, but does it really work? Does it really matter? And so I found that book helpful, some practical things, but more just at a heart level. And one of the things that's humbling and encouraging at the same time, it's been like this for years. When I come back from my summer study break, people invariably say, I always make sure that I'm there the very first Sunday, that we plan our vacation so we can be back the first Sunday you're back. And it's not because of me, but they'll say that's going to be maybe your best sermon of the year because you've had rest, you're fresh, you're reinvigorated, there's a new energy. And so that's encouraging. It's also humbling, and it's good for those of us who are pastors and preachers to realize sometimes we get more worn down and than we realize. So lots of other books that we can talk about. But Justin and Collin, very good to be with you again. Looking forward in the weeks ahead. I have an interview with Jim Neuheiser in our next episode, Lord willing, and teaches counseling at RTS, and going to talk to him about abuse. And so that will be a good conversation. We're trying to line up some other interviews throughout the fall. And of course, all three of us will be together. So thank you. Good to be with you, friends. And for our listeners, glorify God, enjoy Him forever. And until then, read a good book.